So that completes the formal part of our proceedings this evening. And so it now gives me immense pleasure to turn to the topic of our lecture this evening on growing black tall poppies. The speaker is Professor Peter Radoll. He's Professor of Information Technology and is Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous at the University of Canberra. He is a descendant of the Anaiwan people. Excuse me if I don't pronounce that correctly, Peter, you can correct me later, from the New England Ranges area of northern New South Wales. He's director of the Ngunnawal Centre at the University of Canberra, which provides support training and study facilities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Yes, it's certainly something close to his heart. He's also director of the board of the Smith family, the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre, and is a member of the advisory group for the CSIRO Indigenous Girls STEM Academy. He has he has such an interesting background, and I think he's going to give us a fascinating talk. I'm looking forward to it. So let me now introduce Professor Peter Radoll to talk about growing black tall poppies. Thank you, Peter.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm coming to you tonight from the beautiful lands of the Ngunnawal people. I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and just acknowledge and celebrate their continuing culture and the contribution that they make to the fabric of Canberra and region, and particularly my university. Growing tall black poppies. I've created a presentation tonight. I'm about to share that, and I want to share with you a journey of my journey, and then we'll discuss the challenges and opportunities that come along with Indigenous higher education. My mother and father had their challenges, both completing year 8 in high school and going on to become labourers in their own right. My father, third generation Australian from Germany, my mother, Aboriginal on her father's side, and non-Indigenous on her mother's side. For me, I completed year 10, but I want to show you some photos of that journey. This is my photo from year 3. You see 3 of 7 up there. I had 7 schools, 4 primary, 3 high school, and finished year 10. I managed to get through school relatively unscathed for the most part in primary school. As high school emerged, it was a bit tricky. You became a little bit more racist if you're a little bit different or had a different family. And there I am there, sitting right there. Not that much difference in terms of colour, but somehow a little bit different as I became older. Reflecting a little bit on this presentation and the journey, thought I would actually dig up some more information and notes from my school years. And there was one piece of information that I'd almost forgot about. I'm not sure how, but I suppose you get past some things. Particularly topic at the moment around a particular cheese. The yearbook was passed around at year 10 amongst the class, and some encouraging notes were sort of splashed upon that. But one thing was inscribed, which I had forgotten about, and which is there. I've chosen not to give the author because just best not to do that sort of thing publicly like this. But you can see that word is insidious, but I almost wear that as a pride or a badge of honour. It's definitely helped me along the way in terms of thinking about race, culture, and how cruel children can be, kids can be. If you look, I've got fair skin. I've got what they call the Canberra tan. There's not much sunlight down here on a regular basis. It's cold country. But what I do hope that one day that word will disappear from our lexicon and vocabulary, and we will no longer be called anything. We'll just be called Australian. I want to take you on a journey. My journey to university was quite unusual. It was not initiated by me. In fact, it was initiated by two incredible elders, two people who loved me and also believed in me. Picture here of me as a motor mechanic in 1995, but also an NRMA patrol. If you were anywhere near Taree, anywhere between Kalungaluk and Nabiak between 1994 and 1996, we may have already met. In my spare time during that time, I was treasurer of the Gillawara Aboriginal Media Association. And Uncle Ray Hurst and Auntie Pat Davis Hurst were the other executive members of the organisation. Uncle Ray and I would do radio. This is the Courier on 2 Bob FM. We were the 2 Bobs, and since then there's been many more Bobs because the radio station is still called 2 Bob FM in Taree. It was a beautiful day in Taree. We were celebrating Troy Casadale's first ARIA Award. Troy Casadale is a Bundjalung man. He's a country music singer, and he was on the front page of the Koori Mail. The Koori Mail is a national Indigenous newspaper, is still around today. On the back, normally the footy results. We were about to broadcast the footy results, having not prepared very well. The footy results happened to be on the second last page on this edition, because on the back page was an application for a cadetship schemes. The National Indigenous Cadetship Scheme is a process or an opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to come to Canberra, undertake a degree while working for a department. Uncle Ray had read the advert in the back of the Koori Mail that day and said I should apply. And I was pretty sure that I would not make the grade, so naturally excluded myself. But what Auntie Pat and he did afterwards changed my life in a way that I could never have imagined at that time. About 2 weeks later, Auntie Pat had rung me and said to me, I need to get around here now. And Auntie Pat wasn't someone to be trifled with. She was a very strong leader. She commanded respect. And nobody wants to disappoint a cranky aunt. When I arrived at Auntie Pat's house, about 10 minutes later, she flung open the door. You need to get in here, she said. At this point, I thought I'd done something incredibly wrong, not knowing what I did wrong, racking my brain, thinking, what have I done to upset Auntie Pat? I don't think I've done anything. But unbeknownst to me, Auntie Pat and Uncle Ray had actually written to the federal government to get one of the application forms for the cadetship scheme. They'd completed the application form as much as they could, provided me with a first reference, and then sent us off to Canberra. At that time, I was driving a 1976 Toyota Corona, and there were 2 things I was worried about. The first one, did I have enough money to buy petrol to get to Canberra? And the second one, would the Toyota make it the entire way? I achieved my first degree in 2001 and celebrated that with my dearest and closest friends. And in 2011, I jumped in after having graduated with my PhD from ANU. I graduated in information systems. I jumped into my Hyundai iMax, a much newer car, and headed to Taree as quick as I could to share this moment with my now frail mentor. When I arrived, Auntie Pat boasted about achieving her PhD before I did. You see, she was honoured with an honorary doctorate from the University of Newcastle for the enormous contributions that she'd made to the Indigenous community. She beat me by a few months. She would ring me and ask, when are you finishing? I'll finish mine. On the 30th of April 2013, I was honoured to deliver the eulogy for Auntie Pat's funeral. Such a great celebration of her life. While not a state funeral, the Taree police walked ahead of the hearse, demonstrating why she had been awarded both an AO and an AM in her lifetime. She wanted me to make the world a better place, to continue the mentorship and the work that she did. And I hope she would not only be proud of my achievements, but proud of what we have done to continue her work. I hope I'm making A cranky aunt happy. Switching tact. This statistic is what keeps me going and motivates me. One of my colleagues, Professor Yin Paradis at Deakin University, done considerable work in looking at men and women and pathways, jail and discrimination. And he's discovered that an Indigenous male leaving school at the age of 18 today is more likely to go to jail than go to university. This is appalling and something that we as a university sector and we as a country really need to address. I've been fascinated by gender for a considerable time in universities, knowing that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are primarily driven and governed by females and having a very dominant female presence in my life. I was interested in understanding this more broadly coming to university. Not surprisingly, for me at least, is to find that there are many more females in university for the general population, but particularly for the Indigenous population. In the past few years, universities have made a significant increase in Indigenous enrolments. In 2017, which is the current data that's released and verified, in 2017, almost 20,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were studying in university sector. That is a significant increase over time. That is absolutely something that Australians should be proud of. Even though we are 3% of the population, we're only just making 1.8% of the population of the university sector. So while we've seen great outcomes, we still have a significant way to go in terms of achieving population parity in this space. Looking at Indigenous enrolments by level, we can see that increase across the sector is absolutely right across the board, both at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. And we can see that the enabling load in 2017 at 1,700 is absolutely 100% higher than it was in 2018. Now, one of the challenges that we have in the university sector and why the enabling space is so important is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students tend to fail school. We have very poor school completion rates, and we still need that enabling space to continue to stay strong for it to feed our undergraduate and, of course, then our postgraduate courses. One of the challenges we do have, but, and it's something that I've witnessed across the sector, is that the reliance more heavily on enabling programs rather than formal schooling as a form of enrolment or the primary formal pathway into university sector. And us, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, perhaps give a wrong impression to young Indigenous students that they can come to university without trying hard and not succeed at university, but not succeed at school, but to come through a pathway to then succeed at university. It makes it very difficult for students if they do not receive a decent ATAR. Pathways are important, there's no doubt about that. But it's much easier if a student receives a decent ATAR, works hard, receives a decent ATAR, and then goes into the university sector. They are much more likely to be successful. Looking at the undergraduate offers by gender really highlights the gender parity or disparity, the gender parity in the Indigenous community in terms of university enrolments. What we do know is 63% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander enrolments in universities are female, and 55% of university enrolments overall are female. That is not really surprising. What is surprising is the large disparity in gender in the Indigenous student population. Where are all the men? If you are thinking that they're in the TAFE sector, I can tell you that they are not. If you look at TAFE enrolments, they look very similar to what we have in the university sector. Men are just not engaging in any of this type of formal education post-secondary. It is a real challenge that we actually face in Australia. Looking now at the fields of study where Indigenous and non-Indigenous students go into, we can see that society and culture is so important to the Aboriginal community. Now, this presents a significant challenge again. 33% of all Indigenous enrolments are in the society and culture space. 22% are in health, 14% in education, and then you look at the less likely ones, like commerce and management, 10%. The natural and physical sciences, 6%, and then engineering at 3%. And I don't think information technology gets much of a look in, hardly at all. Now, the problem with this is that we are moving towards a digital economy, an economy where engineering and IT is going to be the critical, most important part of our world. We have an Indigenous population that's still focused on society and culture, and that is not creating a space for us to get on board with the new economies. And that is a real problem, because we know that the jobs are not going to be in society and culture in the future. They're going to be in the technology and the engineering space. We need more of our people to go into that space. Additionally, with the current HEX scheme changes, the proposed HEX scheme changes, the Indigenous community is going to carry a greater burden. At 33% of our enrolments are in the society and culture, where the HEX is going to at least double in some of those degrees. It's going to load up the Indigenous population with a HEX debt much higher proportionally than the non-Indigenous population. Again, I don't think this is what the government intended. I do think they want to push us into the new economy, but incentivising HEX and penalising the Aboriginal community is not going to achieve the outcome I think that we all want to achieve. One of the things that universities do their hardest at is to complete students, and it is a real tricky challenge for universities to get significantly high completions. We know that the 9-year completion rate for all students is about 74%, but I don't know if you know that the 9-year completion rate for Indigenous students is just 47%, which means 53% of all Indigenous enrolments today in 9 years' time will still not have completed. They will have dropped out or matriculated, or they would not have completed their degree. Now, this is a real challenge for us. If you look at the 6-year completion rates and the 4-year completion rates, they're even worse. This is a real difficult challenge for the university sector. We've seen significant enrolments. The universities are funded to support Indigenous students under the Indigenous Student Success Program. There's about $70 million that are funded across universities to ensure the success of Aboriginal and Torres Strait students. In fact, the formula back in 2017, the formula was changed to incentivise completions. So now the universities get funded equal portions for completions, for retention, and for attraction, so for enrolment. So we are now incentivised. These figures are from 2017, so the latest figures. So perhaps as we go forward, there may be some increase in completions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait students, but a 47% completion rate for Indigenous students that's stubbornly low is a very difficult thing for us to address. If you ever look at the 6-year and the 4-year completion rates, they are more up-to-date data. You can actually see that there's not a lot of change. In fact, if you look at the more recent data, it's actually trending downwards slightly, but it's hard to tell. They're very small numbers. So now if we looked at completions, this is completions by gender. If we look at completions by gender for Indigenous students, and I suspect that non-Indigenous students would be very similar, and forgive me for not doing a comparison on that, but I just wanted to highlight the challenges that we have, the disparity again, if you like, with women graduating considerably more than twice as many Indigenous females graduate from universities than males, and that again is really problematic. It reflects not only the enrolments, but also suggests that women are more focused, more completions, and again really demonstrates how women lead the Indigenous community more generally, in the same with universities as well. That is absolutely a fantastic graph to show you the gender disparity in our communities. Switching to university staff now, I think it's really important to have a look at where have we achieved, what have we achieved in the past few years in terms of attracting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff to university. Again, the increase in staff is painfully slow. We do see that there's less than 1,500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff across all universities. And if you look at that figure, in fact, the graph there from 2017, but I did the analysis on the raw data from the department today, and in this year, or beg your pardon, last year, we had just under 1,500 staff, and 68% of those staff in the university, Indigenous staff in universities, were female. Just 32% were male. If you look at the academic staff cohort, it's a real problematic again. We know that, at least anecdotally from Universities Australia, that there are 450 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics in the sector at the moment. Around 200 of those are actually at retirement age. So we've got a real problem with that, and we'll talk about the age demographic of Indigenous academics and staff in a few moments. The problem is, well, we're hoping that academics do not retire, but of course the challenge is that we just, Indigenous staff tend to have a lot of underlying health challenges as they become older. They also have a shorter life expectancy, anywhere between 11 years and 17 years, depending on how you calculate the death rate. But we do know that generally Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people just do not live as long as non-Indigenous people. So there are many challenges to overcome in this space. Anecdotally, again, through Universities Australia, the academic workforce is about 50-50 in terms of a male and female Indigenous, with the majority of the females taking up the non-academic roles. It's very difficult to become an academic. Anyone knows who's done a PhD knows it's very challenging. We have a 47% completion rate for undergraduate students. We have even a lower percentage completing PhDs and in honours and masters. It is a real challenge for us to actually develop a sustainable pipeline, and that's why we're looking for other opportunities to bring Indigenous people into the academy. It is really tricky. This is proportion of staff under the age of 40 years old. And you can see that the Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff there in the respective colours, but you can just see that the non-Indigenous workforce is much younger than the Indigenous workforce. And again, except for the non-academic, you can see there's a younger workforce for non-Indigenous people in the non-academic space. But overall, you can see something like 30% of non-Indigenous staff in the university sector are actually under the age of 40, where for all staff, only about 18% of the Indigenous workforce is under 40. So that presents some challenges for us. Looking at the share of staff by academic function, we've seen a significant growth over time in research, particularly Indigenous research-only positions. I think that is really exciting. I think there's a bit of a trend there to have teaching-only positions. And again, I think that is really a great opportunity to actually pathway academics, particularly junior academics, into an academic career. I suppose this gives you a taste of what an academic looks like. I know our institution, I know other institutions have what they call teaching-only Indigenous fellows. I think it's a great opportunity to sort of give an opportunity to an Indigenous person to come in and have a look at what academia looks like, and get you in front of a class and see if that will inspire you. I know it inspires a lot of people. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but I know it inspires a lot of people. I know we have a couple of Indigenous-only fellows currently undertaking PhDs in my institution. That is a great pathway. So what are we doing to try and address some of the challenges in this space? So Universities Australia created an Indigenous strategy in 2017, But there were two notable pieces of work that were conducted prior to that work being completed. So the first one, undertaken by Universities Australia in 2000, was a best practice framework for Indigenous cultural competency in universities. Now, that was a very thick volume of work. Best practice, it really highlighted some really exciting and excellent work that was being conducted across universities. The sector really relied on that very heavily for a period, and of course in 2000 and 2012, the Barrett Review of Indigenous Higher Education across Australia looked at, again, not only best practice, but how can we progress and move things forward in a more structured way. Of course, all that sort of underpinned a lot of the work that we currently do and a lot of the thinking that we currently do have across the sector. And also just making sure that those two pieces of work were connected back to a broader objective. Internationally, they had the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People sort of underpinned all of that work. So that piece of work has been really, really important. In terms of the Universities Australia's Indigenous Strategy, which completes this year, so we're not sure what we're going to do for the next one, but the underlying of principles, there were three underlying principles for that initiative, for that strategy: increase Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander numbers of people participating in higher education, that's students, graduates and academics, increase the engagement of non-Indigenous people with Indigenous knowledge, culture, educational approaches, and to improve the university environment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I want to focus on that second one just for a few moments. It's really important to understand that in the university sector, there are not enough Indigenous people across the sector to achieve a better outcome for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. And that includes getting more of our students to complete on time. We need the support of non-Indigenous allies to help us to achieve a greater outcome, whether that's donating some of your time, understanding what Indigenous curriculum is, understanding what building or improving university environment is, or getting on board with a reconciliation action plan or a university's Indigenous strategy. We need your help. We cannot do this on our own. It's important, I think, as Indigenous leaders in the space, that we give every non-Indigenous person permission to have a go, be brave. We're not always going to get it right. That is just a matter of fact. But we should give you permission to have a go and guide you where you need some guidance to assist. Without your help, we are not going to achieve the outcome that we so desire. Now, switching to my university just for a few moments, and I'm going to go through the next few slides about what we're doing at my university. About 18 months ago, we embarked on an indigenisation framework. But the foundation of that framework, not only did we do some review of documents, particularly the Barrett Review, the Cultural Competency Framework, but 18 months ago, I took all the Indigenous staff at the University of Canberra off campus and we fleshed out for the day a definition of indigenisation. Now, that was a very robust discussion. It was very collegial. It was very challenging at times. You got 22. At the time, we had 22 Indigenous staff. We now have 44 at the University of Canberra. We had 22 Indigenous staff. We had elders, local elders, sometimes with very different views. At the end of the day, we came up with a definition that we all could work with, that we were all happy with. We provided that definition of indigenisation to the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Learning and Teaching, and then that area, the learning and teaching space, then took on the indigenisation, building the indigenisation framework around the curriculum that we already had, but also the curriculum renewal project as well. Now, that was really critical. That wasn't something that I wanted to take on in my area. It was something that we had to build into the core components of what the institution was doing, and we managed to achieve that. That indigenisation framework was approved through Education Committee, and then through academic board. And now that indigenisation framework sits as a core component of the curriculum renewal process of the university now. No degree from April this year can go through academic board now without having Indigenous content. It doesn't matter whether it's physics or science or maths, it has to have Indigenous content. And that is a great achievement. Not many universities have actually been brave enough to do that, but we are determined, and I am determined, to continue the work that only Pat started and to make sure that we're going to make a better place for not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but for all Australians. As part of that process, we've established a task force, an Indigenous Student Completion Task Force. We do want to increase student completions, Indigenous student completions. In fact, we want to have parity by 2023 between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. We started on this process in 2017. We actually think that within 6 years we'll actually achieve a significant increase in completions. At the moment, we are very lucky where University of Canberra sits at 61%, 6-year completion rate. We want to see that up around 74% before I finish my contract. We are tracking very well. We will achieve great outcomes in that space. Whether we meet the 74%, we're not quite sure, but we are tracking very, very well to achieve that. Again, that's not just my area doing the work, that's the faculties, learning and teaching, and everybody getting on board and supporting our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. We want to be the first university, other than a group of 8, to have parity. Now, the group of 8 do have parity, and that's because they choose which students to take. And they need to, because that's the process of having worked at ANU and worked in a similar role, senior role at ANU previously. We could not take students that University of Canberra takes. ANU could just not take those students because they would just not be successful. We are, University of Canberra is an open university. You do not require an ATAR. You do not require any assistance or support through the secondary education system to get into university. We will let you in to give you a go. So it's really important to understand that. We are an accessible university that will give you an opportunity, and as a result, we'll achieve great things. Indigenous student content and degrees. At the moment, we have 32% of all of our degrees have Indigenous content, and that was quite a surprise. No university would have 0. If you cannot have a health degree or an education degree without Indigenous content, now you just not get those degrees accredited without that content in there. It's really important to understand that. Again, we have a target by 2023 to have 100% of all of our degrees, 100% of our degrees, our coursework degrees, and that includes postgraduate, even our PhD coursework will have Indigenous course content in there. It is important that we have Indigenous content right across all the spectrum, our undergraduate, postgraduate coursework, and the PhD coursework as well. We need to have that degree content in everything we do to make sure that we actually enable and make it accessible not only to our Indigenous students, but also to enlighten and empower our non-Indigenous students as well. Just that last point there, we're currently undertaking a research project to see how we can better support our undergraduate and postgraduate students in terms of on-time completions. It's quite a bit of research already undertaken in that space, but we want to see, is there something unique that we can do as a University of Canberra to support our students? About 2 years ago, I embarked on something I didn't think I would ever achieve. And I managed to, surprisingly, I asked if I could propose that we have an Indigenous treatment as a part of the corporate style guide of the university. We're the only university in the country to have this. The way I did this was to actually say that we need to build, as part of the 3 points of the Indigenous strategy that UA put out, was about creating an environment, a safe environment or an engaged environment for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That treatment or the look and feel of the university is critical in that process. Undertook a large scale and very broad consultation process with Indigenous, non-Indigenous stakeholders, both internal and external, and we came up with a value set, a set of values, trust, culture and respect, diversity, collaboration and unity, innovation, thinking differently and embedding culture, the future in stakeholders, and those elements came together to create this piece of artwork. That is absolutely fantastic. These are the elements that we think as a collective, not just the Indigenous community, by the way. These are non-Indigenous people across our university. These are internal, external stakeholders, our Ngunnawal elders. These are really important values to us, and this is where we've landed. As part of that, the university is committed to rolling out this treatment across social media, particularly during National Reconciliation Week and NAIDOC Week. And this has been a great talking point. Again, you have to remember the University of Canberra is the only university in the country to have an Indigenous treatment as part of the corporate style guide. So we're very lucky to be able to do this. And building on this, not only in the digital space and socials, but even on the website, we've actually put some of those elements, those single elements into the website. We have used the University of Canberra Capital's first Indigenous round, had the full motif, the full Indigenous treatment, both on the shirts and the shorts. We have presentations and gifts. Our PowerPoint presentations also have Indigenous elements on it. And if you look in the bottom right-hand corner there, we now have carpet with the Indigenous treatment on it throughout Building 2 and Building 1. These are the main buildings at the University of Canberra and the teaching halls as well. And just recently, as last month, we actually opened the new Ngunnawal Centre. That Indigenous treatment is not only embedded in the carpet here, but if you look in the vinyl, there's elements, those Indigenous treatment elements are actually built into the vinyl as well. This was an incredible opportunity for the University of Canberra. We had a benefactor who wanted to donate money to create a sculpture that would be unifying, something that would bring students together, something that meant something to not only to them, but to the student body. He came with a lot of money, and he said to us, I want to have this, and that's what we've created here, but he wanted to have Indigenous elements in that as well. The sculpture is called One. It's meant to be unifying. Arnie Ros, our elder in residence, gave it a Ngunnawal word called Galambani, which means we together with you, or we together as one, which meant there's quite a great synergy between one and Galambani. So that's dual named. And if you look in those lovely metal plates at the bottom of that sculpture, you'll see the Indigenous treatment is actually embedded into that sculpture as well. Absolutely great collaboration. And again, it's about building this environment, this built and digital environment that's welcoming to Aboriginal and Torres Strait people. It is so important. Again, we have a great space here. Just near the library, we built a garden called Nalajima, and please forgive my little picture covering up that sign. Nalajima means plants big and small in Ngunnawal. We actually took the Ngunnawal people to the University of Canberra. We asked them, what are the most important plants associated with their culture? They provided that to us. We planted that. We've got the Vice-Chancellor there, Professor Deep Saini. He is our immediate past Vice-Chancellor. He's now gone back to Canada. And our elder in residence, Arnie Ros Brown. She's a senior Ngunnawal elder here in Canberra. They planted the first plant, and then that garden has grown incredibly well. We thought that the Institute of Applied Ecology and students from there would be the ones who would use that. It turns out that other students, particularly and academics, particularly those who are doing poetry and creative writing, come there. It's a beautiful, quiet, serene place to sit. It's much more established now with some beautiful turf and some seating. It's absolutely a beautiful place, but it's just so serene. But it's about, again, building the environment to ensure that not only are we learning as Aboriginal and Torres Strait people and feeling happy and connected, but a lot of non-Indigenous people come to this space as well and learn about culture, learn about what's important to Ngunnawal people, but also celebrate and enjoy what we enjoy, the serenity of that beautiful space there. Now, I want to introduce you to Brad Mogridge, Kamilaroi man, far left, someone who I've admired for a very long time. I've known Brad for a considerable time. Back in 2007, he and I worked with CSIRO and Questacon and created a great number of marketing material. We were trying to create a whole lot of STEM professionals. Brad's a water scientist, currently undertaking his PhD with myself and Ross Thompson at the Institute of Applied Ecology at the University of Canberra. I'm incredibly proud of Brad. He's had a fantastic career with CSIRO, New South Wales Water. He's done about 7 keynotes last year right around the world on cultural water flows and the importance that cultural water flows are to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities right across our country. Turns out there's a strong connection to Maori culture as well in terms of the water flow. So there he is, the namesake of the presentation. Brad is the ACT Tall Poppy this year for 2019. He won that award. Couldn't be more proud of his achievements. Supported him. He worked for CSIRO. When the drought broke, they got rid of all the water scientists, and it was just an opportunity. I contacted him and said, "Is it time for your PhD?" And so he's almost completed his PhD now, and he's just been appointed as an associate professor with us in the Institute of Applied Ecology in the Research Centre for Water Science. So incredibly proud of his achievements and what he's doing. I want to introduce you to another student who's just submitted her PhD at the University of Oxford. Haven't been able to speak to her personally yet and congratulate her, except I did post a little post on her social media congratulating on the fantastic news that she's achieved, submitted her PhD at Oxford. And I just want to note, as anyone in this space would feel a great sense of achievement, she credits me a little bit for her achievement. I think that's probably overly generous. I've spent a lot of time with Sarah over a number of years. Her grandfather is Colin Burke, the first Aboriginal professor in Australia. Her father is Chris Burke, the first Aboriginal dentist in Australia. I think she was always destined for great things. She probably didn't know that herself, but I think those who knew of her and knew her capability and capacity knew that she would be absolutely fantastic. First met Sarah when I worked at ANU, and I've stayed in contact with her over many years. I'm just incredibly excited to see that she's completed her PhD and make not only her grandparents and her parents and many other people incredibly happy and proud of her. So that is, in a nutshell, our 2 fantastic people who I wanted to highlight tonight and provide and say that I've contributed just a little bit in passing on some of Annie Pat's mentorship and well wishes to support the next generation of Indigenous tall black poppies. I want to leave you with this tonight. It's Carla Dickens' Second Skin. Carla Dickens is a Wiradjuri woman, an artist, and it really highlights for me something that I absolutely treasure in both my mother, our mothers, our other mothers and our extended mothers and our women in our community. Covered in battle scars and 2-bit armour, the warrior finds peaceful moments sitting in reflection, digging up courage and more raw nerve, licking deep wounds. She prepares to rise once more, fighting the next round. Beaten and bruised, she shines, our mother. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much for a great opportunity to present to you tonight. And I hope and look forward to seeing you and discussing more with you at the presentation on the 5th of August. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. That was a lovely, really uplifting talk. I've got a lot of questions here on my screen, a lot of overlapping questions too. Lots of positive comments about your presentation, how uplifting it is. And one question wanted to know why you called it Tall Poppies, but I think you probably got to that in the end. So unless you want to elaborate, it is the fertilisation to grow the tall poppies we actually saw at the end of your talk. So thank you. It's good to see those achievements. So as I said, there's a couple of overlapping questions, but I'll start with maybe one maybe you can't answer this one. How do you have Indigenous content in some of the particularly difficult or higher level science subjects, say for higher maths or physics? I think of the examples I've got here. Now, I know you're not a mathematician or a physicist, but But you might have some clues about how Indigenous content is embedded into the curriculum.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and thank you so much for that question. Look, we're all going to have trouble and challenges in embedding lots of different aspects, Indigenous aspects to curriculum. I think one of the really interesting things is a big push or a big sort of interest at the moment in Indigenous astronomy. And I think, you know, if you go back a few years ago, people would never have thought there's an opportunity to embed Indigenous anything in astronomy. And now you have a number, I think there's a lot of competing now, wonderful superstars in the Indigenous astronomy space, including Carly Noon, who again was someone who I had the great opportunity to mentor into the role where she is at the moment. I think, look, it's not without the challenges. I think it's the way we look at things and perspectives. And I think it's really important to understand that if you look hard enough and conceptualize, you will actually find something associated with every discipline. And what I used to do at ANU, when I taught information systems at ANU, was I would, especially the especially the database design unit that I taught, I would actually get people to consider how the worldview, because our worldview shapes what we do. So consider the worldview from an Indigenous perspective. So I would, quite controversially, by the way, show a slide, back in the slide days, the overhead projector, of an Aboriginal man sitting at Bennelong Point and the ship's coming in and saying, you know, he's saying boat people are bringing diseases. But of course, I was being provocative, but also saying that, you know, our worldview about how we construct databases and architecture is really critical. So I think if you look hard enough, and I haven't got a perfect solution at this moment, but I'm pretty confident if I looked and thought about this a little bit more and read some more, particularly in the Indigenous philosophical space, I would find content in there for sure.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. Okay, onto something completely different. So one question I would like to know, what's happened to all the missing males? So they're not at university, they're not at TAFE, so where are they?
Again, that's a really good question, Liz, and thank you so much for the opportunity to answer that. Look, the saddest thing, to be quite honest, a lot of males are caught up in the justice system. That is just the truth. I mean, I did some really wonderful work with the Australian Digital Futures Institute, University of Southern Queensland some years back. It really highlighted to me just how many Indigenous males are in jail. That piece of work were some wonderful work that was actually embedding computers into jails, what was called the in-cell laptop program, to provide education for detainees. So then there was an opportunity for those detainees to actually have careers post jail. Looking again at the work I did when I worked at the University of Newcastle, I engaged quite strongly with the Baxter Detention Centre, and at that time, 80% of the inmates were actually Indigenous. So we know that the problem is we've got such a problem with the justice system. The figures are, there's 30% of the jail. We make up 3% of the Indigenous population makes up 3%. The Indigenous population makes up 3% of the total population of Australia. Unfortunately, Indigenous adult males make up 30% of the jail population. If you look at the juvenile detention centres, 60% of the juvenile detention centres actually filled with Indigenous males. So that's where they are, unfortunately. And it's quite common, not just here in Australia, it's common in New Zealand, the United States, and also in Canada. So those first world countries seem to lock up Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples. And whether that's a misalignment of values or there's other challenges, I'm sure there's a fair bit of work done on that.
So are there other schemes besides the one you've cited in jails to support Indigenous students to, develop skill sets that help them after they're released?
Yes, there's a lot of, all jurisdictions will have some sort of education program. There is I can talk very strongly from the ACT perspective. We have a Ngunnawal bush healing farm in the ACT. ACT has the first human rights compliant prison in Australia. It was the Alexander McConaughey Centre. Those who know history will know Alexander McConaughey from being quite a progressive man. The mark system that he used on to actually to reward good prisoners, if you like. Unfortunately, Alexander McConaughey, those who are history buffs will know that he was sent back to England because he was just too kind to prisoners. We have the Alexander McConaughey Centre here in Australia, in Canberra. We have a halfway house, if you like, a full residential premise for transition out of jail. And then for those Indigenous detainees, we actually have the bush healing farm where they can actually come out and be transitioned. So there's lots of things that actually happen for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but preventing recidivism is still a major challenge. If those who've ever been into a prison system, everything is very structured. You got your meals, your workout time, your sleep time, everything is very, very structured. Everything is free, so your medication's free, doctors are free. When you come out of jail, unfortunately, you sort of, it's not an easy transition for prisoners to come out into an unstructured environment and where you have to pay. And unfortunately, it's very hard if you've been an ex-convict to actually obtain reasonable employment.
You mentioned similar problems in other first world countries. So I wondered, how does First Peoples education in Australia compare with New Zealand, USA, Canada?
Again, that's a very good question, Liz. Thank you.
It wasn't me.
Well, thank you for the question.
I'm being fed questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. I can talk quite authoritatively from Canadian perspective. Look, we are only 3% of the population here in Australia, much higher in terms of population in Canada. Canada's a little bit more accepting of their Indigenous people than we are. And I think because, and similar to the New Zealand, where there is a treaty, and so culture is actually sort of more embedded and more pronounced because it's actually part of the sort of governance system or the government system, if you like. It's interesting, one of the things I wasn't quite prepared for in Canada was that there's a really strong and really good relationship between the Indigenous people of Canada and the Crown. In Australia, it's not the same, and same in New Zealand, not the same as well. And I think it's because of the treaty, the early treaties that they had in Canada made a difference. So there are similar outcomes across the world for Indigenous people. If you look at, there's a couple of really good examples I think that are absolutely fantastic. If you look at University of Saskatchewan, they are actually great leaders in this space. If you look at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan in Canada, they actually have an organisation, it's a federated college. It's not quite a university, but called it's a federated college of the University of Regina, and it is called the First Nations University. So very progressive. So the First Nations University has very, very good outcomes. If you look at New Zealand again, a great example, the Maori over in New Zealand, they've actually have their own universities. They don't actually have, there's a couple of universities that are actually Maori only in terms of Maori run. Non-Indigenous students, or what they call Pakeha students, can actually enroll in those universities as well. So there's different models that have much better success. So it looks like the Indigenous run universities, if you like, seem to have a much better success than the non-Indigenous led universities.
You showed some data of students, increasing levels of Indigenous students. I wonder if you know whether they're largely coming from regional or rural or urban areas.
Again, that's a very good question. We do know that there's a significant increase right across the board. I mentioned to you in the presentation that the Indigenous Student Success Program, about $71 million, is actually cut up, sliced up. I mentioned the three sort of primary areas, the enrollment, retention and completion, 30%. Universities will receive for every student. There is a 10% component if you bring an Indigenous student from a regional or remote community. The primary growth in terms of Indigenous students is actually right across the sector, both in urban and rural and remote areas. The remote is much more difficult because you've got to remove students from their culture, remove students from home. But you're seeing now there's a bit of a trickle effect, really. So you've got organisations like the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation are bringing kids from remote areas into urban areas to go to school, like the really wonderful non-government schools like the Knox and others in Sydney and in Melbourne. Fantastic work they're really doing in so many ways in terms of providing opportunities, whether it's the right thing to remove kids from their community and culture and bring them to Sydney and teach them the Western world, if you like. That's really a debate somewhere else to be had. I mean, I think the more opportunities you can provide to Indigenous kids is going to be better for their family. We know that there's a better outcome. And what we do know, similar to low SES students, if an Indigenous student comes to university, then usually there's a sibling or a mum or an aunt. And I've seen at my university, at least, where there's been the grandmother, the mother, and the granddaughter all studying at the same time. Absolutely fantastic.
Great. So do you see that the availability of online education might improve opportunities for Indigenous students in remote areas because they could live in country?
Oh, no, that again is a very good question. And it goes really to my research. For those who don't know, I research in the area of diffusion, particularly the uptake of information technology in Indigenous households. And unfortunately, the access or the uptake of information technology in a meaningful way, I'm talking about broadband technologies, and Indigenous households in remote areas is very low. It sits around about 25% of Indigenous households, where non-Indigenous households sit around about 90+% in those remote communities. Even though they're the same location, same geographical location, there's quite a significant difference. Also, just plugging my new paper that hasn't quite been published yet, but has been accepted, is that we've seen a significant decrease in the Indigenous community significant decrease in the use of technology, where the Indigenous community is giving up the technology between the two censuses, between the censuses that we had recently. We've got a bit of an idea about why cost is a really inhibiting factor. If you live remotely, you do need, and we're very lucky to live in urban areas. I think I pay about $80 a month for optical fiber to come into my house, and I've got everything I want, unlimited. But $80 a month will give you only a few megabytes in a remote area. And I have a decent job, and I think $80 is a lot of money. But if if you're living on welfare or you don't have a job at all, finding $80 for a 20 megabyte download limit for a month, very tricky, because everything is, all our universities and education is very rich in terms of content, and we need high bandwidths, but also very large download requirements. So yes, short answer is yes, but very difficult to do.
Yes, maybe some of that $70 million in Indigenous success could be channeled into increasing the service provision. Okay, one of our audience wants to know a little bit more about the mentor scheme that's operating in the University of Canberra.
Oh, that's fantastic. So yes, so there's a couple of programs that we do use. There's a program we call the Indigenous tutorial program, and that's a one-on-one program that the government, we facilitate that through our university. Most universities will have this, by the way, as part of that $70 million commitment to the higher education sector, Indigenous success. It's a one-on-one program. If you're an Indigenous student who is enrolled in a unit of study, requires some additional assistance, they will be provided a tutor, a suitable tutor, who's qualified in that discipline for 2 hours a week for every one of their units of study. We have roughly 300 students at the University of Canberra. About 30 students take that opportunity up. It's unfortunate that more don't. I'm surprised that they don't, but they don't. And that's right across the board. I also have another mentoring program. So we provide through widening participation. It's not my area, but I work closely with widening participation in my university. And through Laurie Peretti's area and the Dean of Students, we actually provide mentoring to Indigenous students usually for the first few weeks of the university, try and demystify what's going on, because we all know that university, if you're the first in family, it's really difficult to understand it, even where to find the library or how to get a student card, or there's just the really basic things that you think that should be easy, but it's very difficult for the first time, first in families.
Yep. Now here's a numbers question you may know the answer to. I've got a question about what percentage of Australian students are actually Indigenous of the total. If you exclude international students, what is
university at the moment?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's one of my slides. 1.8% at this current time. Yeah.
Okay.
Look, and that's a really good question. That's a really good question. So there are many more international students than Indigenous students enrolled in universities, which is surprising. Well, maybe not, but it's surprising to me because Indigenous students attract 2 buckets of funding to university. So the first bucket of funding is a Commonwealth supported place. And then the second bucket of funding is the Indigenous Student Success Program. So if you were thinking of, if there's a really good business case to attract Indigenous students to your university, because they come with 2 buckets of money.
Right, now look, I've had lots of questions on this one. I'll try and summarise. It says, what can we old white males do to support Indigenous people in Indigenous success, as we talked? I thought there's probably some old white females that probably ask the same question. So essentially, what can we as non-Indigenous peoples do to help?
Look, there's so much you can do, really. I think I'll predicate. I'll start this conversation with probably with some knowledge, I suppose, or some experience for me. Non-Indigenous people want to do things to help us, but they're often too worried or concerned about getting it wrong and then not doing it. And a dear friend of mine, Christina, she's the chair of the Indigenous leader, the Indigenous elected body here in the ACT. We've got an Indigenous body that's elected. She's a current chair. She's also an internationally famous NRL player. She played internationally for us. And she's also on the NRL board. So she's a director or commissioner for the NRL as well. And she uses the term, when a non-Indigenous person wants to do something, but is too scared to do something, and too scared to get it wrong, she calls that reconciliation paralysis. And it's a really interesting term. I do get that some parts of our community can be really difficult to deal with, and I don't apologize for that, because some people are really hurt by what's happened in terms of colonization. People have been locked up in jail for things that they probably shouldn't have been locked up for jail. So I know there's a deep hurt, a deep sorrow, and a deep sadness right across the Aboriginal community. But there are a few of us, quite a few of us, who are actually asking non-Indigenous people to come into this space and help us. We're not going to achieve the outcome we require to achieve without the help of non-Indigenous people. So what I say to people when they ask this question is, be brave, go and have a talk. And there's going to be an Aboriginal Land Council somewhere. There's going to be a school somewhere. There's going to be Indigenous students in universities. There's going to be Indigenous corporations somewhere that will need your support, that will need your expertise to actually be successful. And it's really important. There's some tips, but if you're going to engage in that space, there's some tips. You'll get a lot of, it's going to be awkward. There may be some really robust, difficult conversations, and we're all big, and I think we can work through those conversations. There will be times of very silence. And a colleague recently was doing some work in the Indigenous space, and she said to me, I've emailed all these Aboriginal people, but no one's got back to me. So I just went ahead and did the project anyway. And now she's caused herself a little bit of grief. And I said, did you ever think about picking up the phone and speaking with those people and saying, why haven't you responded, or why didn't you reply? Because that would have been a great conversation to have, and the project that you're working on would have had a much better outcome. But so you got to think, so I would encourage you to be really brave. I know there's wonderful people who work with the Smith family, work with the local schools, work with all these different organisations that have Indigenous engagement. I would implore you to actually be brave, engage with the local Aboriginal community. provide your expertise, because your expertise are going to be so valuable to so many people. And one of the things that I've learned at a very professional level is that when you get to a level of seniority, there are no more Indigenous mentors for you. No one's there. There's a big gap. You're it. And that's a very lonely space. So oversharing a little bit with you, I do have a great Indigenous mentor, Tom Calmer, our current Chancellor at the University of Canberra. And he's mentored me for a very long time. I think 2002 when we first met, and he's helped me along my way ever since then. But besides him, all my mentors are not Indigenous. And it's really important to understand the influence and impact that you can have. It's just got to be a little bit brave. It's not always going to be pretty, by the way, but it's really important to work through those awkward moments, because we all have those in life.
Great, thank you, Peter. Well, we've run out of the questions, so I'm actually going to hand you over to Christy, who's going to do the thank you. But I personally thank you, Peter. It was a wonderful talk.
I'm Christy Slade, and as I say, I've taken on the role of chair, and it's such a delight for me to be able to thank you, Peter, for this address. The President said that we're in our 200th year, and I think it really is a very good time, a welcome time for us as a learned society to take seriously the issue of the participation and success of Indigenous Australians in institutes of higher education. And I think your address has been absolutely inspiring. The story of your coming into higher education is a gem. It's an absolute gem. I suspect that there are not many fellows of this Royal Society who started life as motor mechanics, but perhaps there are quite a few who would have liked to. But I think what's extraordinary is how positive you've stayed through this extraordinary career of yours. And I think that's been a very welcome message for us all. The data that you gave us is striking and important. And I'm sure that many others will be feeling, as I did, a need to explore that data a little more, but also a feeling. I was 20 years in the higher education sector in Australia before I went to Britain. And this has really made me feel I should have done more. It is a very important message to us all. And I think we need now to stop giving excuses. What you've done is quite remarkable. I just find your enthusiasm and your ability to be optimistic just striking. And what is happening at the University of Canberra, I think, is even more exciting. I think those stories that you're putting in front of us, as I must say, I did wonder about mathematical logic and Indigenous content, but I'm sure that you'd find some way to get it in there. I think also that these positive stories, the tall black poppies like Sarah Burke, who's just submitted her PhD, these are stories that need to get wider currency. They're really important. But I think there's one other part that has hit me quite hard by listening to you. We're now in a situation where borders and distance are almost as big a barrier as they were 200 years ago for those who are involved in study. Of course, we have these marvelous technologies which mean that we can stay in contact. But it's going to be extremely important for the next generation of all students, but particularly Indigenous students, that they have the opportunities to travel and see and have opportunities to study abroad, as so many of us have had. And it seems to me that that's something that I need to put my mind to a little bit and think about, because I feel very strongly that we were extraordinarily lucky. So I'm very grateful. I will just mention again, as the President did, the two lectures that are coming up in Science Week, Robert Clancy and Bryn Hibbert. I've heard both of those lectures. They are both stunning. They're really fantastic teachers, each of them, and I think worth listening to. I should also say that we had hoped to have a visit to Robert Clancy's historic maps exhibition in Manly in August, but I think that's not possible in August. I think things are so not going very well, and I think that wouldn't be wise, but we do have another possibility on the 14th of October, so we'll let you know about that. And of course, our next speaker is Professor John Rasko, a haematologist from the University of Sydney, whom you might have heard giving the Boyer lectures 2 years ago. He's very interested in stem cell and genetic technologies, and I think that will be very exciting. So that one's on the 2nd of September. So on that, Peter, thank you very much. I think you've given us all a great deal to think about, and we wish you well in chilly Canberra, quite chilly elsewhere. So thank you very much. Ian, I don't know whether I hand over to you for a formal closure.
Yes, please, you go ahead and do it.
I hereby close this meeting, and again, all our thanks to you, Peter.
Good. Thanks very much, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So well.
Au revoir.